As Olivia Lang sat listening to the Beach Boys, she became entranced by one song in particular, Thoughts of You. More specifically, one lyric. Loneliness is a very special place. You can picture it. A writer in her mid-30s swallowed by the backdrop of bustling New York City, wondering how she felt lonely in a city of millions. Lang isn't the only one to be stirred by loneliness. It is animated art, music, poetry, chemistry, even neuroscience. And for the most part, there's one consistent message. We don't want to be alone. But COVID-19 has forced most of us into it, and the pandemic has renewed fears of an epidemic, one of loneliness. Scholars and physicians warn of the devastating effects the emotion can have on our bodies and minds. But as author Faybound Alberti argues in her 2020 book, The Biography of Loneliness, for all fears of a loneliness epidemic, we have failed to actually understand what we fear. She contends, the emotion is not a universal feeling, nor is it one devoid of historical context. To Alberti, it is a modern condition that we need to study before we stigmatize. Nonetheless, as NPR on January 23, 2020 warns, 3 out of every 5 Americans claim to be lonely, and more than half of them are at a greater risk of death because of it. So before we rush to declare a loneliness epidemic, let's do our research. By defining what loneliness is, finding out how we got here, and exploring implications, Haruki Murakami wrote in his short story, Sputnik's Sweetheart, millions of people in this world, all of them yearning yet isolating themselves. Was the earth put here just to nourish human loneliness? Let's find out. Loneliness crosses borders and oceans. In 2018, England appointed a Minister of Loneliness to address the over 2 million British citizens who reported feeling lonely. Let's define loneliness from biological and historical perspectives. To begin, we can define loneliness as a biological, neurochemical phenomenon. The MIT Tech Review on September 4th, 2020 explains, scientists are still struggling to wrap their minds around how exactly loneliness affects the body. But we do know it's linked to physical symptoms, such as depression, anxiety, drug abuse, and the overproduction of hormones like cortisone. The Guardian on August 6, 2020 explains, scientists are even tracking levels of oxytocin, the happy hormone, in the brain, and report differences in the production of the hormone between people who are chronically lonely and those who are not. The ultimate goal of these scientists is to create a pill to increase levels of oxytocin and mitigate the devastating effects of the emotion. In essence, we hope to neurochemically cure loneliness. Next, we can also define loneliness as a historical phenomenon. Time on April 29th, 2020 explains that for loneliness to exist, 2 key factors need to be present. The first is a lack of meaning in relationships. Prior to the 1800s, religion was the primary source of meaning. The waning influence of religion removed historic explanations for our existence and our collective relationships with each other. Suddenly, the search for meaning was inconclusive. The second factor is a discrete sense of self. The Guardian on February 8th, 2020 explains, after the Enlightenment, people began to see themselves as individuals, as economically, spiritually, and politically discrete from each other. This lack of meaning, and seeing ourselves as fundamentally individual, led to the historical construction of loneliness, allowing us to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. A recent study by KDM Snell notes, nearly 60% of households are people living alone, myself included. And while it's nice to walk around my apartment in the nude, it's an eyebrow-raising trend. So how did we get here? Urbanization and technology. First, urbanization has fast-tracked our path towards loneliness. Pew Research on March 23, 2020 explains that in more prosperous countries, households begin to grow smaller as individuals are economically encouraged to migrate towards cities. Yet Forbes on November 18, 2020 explains cities have double the risk of isolation, stress, and, you guessed it, loneliness. From privatizing public spaces into fractured housing, to lacking a sense of community in cities, the paradox is staggering. Despite rubbing shoulders with millions, urban centers are hotbeds for this phenomenon. Chronic loneliness, as the New Yorker explains on March 30th, 2020, is no longer a passing experience overshadowed by community, but a forced result of urbanization. Next, ever since the invention and popularization of the radio, technology has been advertised as the cure to loneliness. CNET on June 18, 2020 explains, technology facilitates loneliness in two key ways. First, it creates the illusion of connections. We expend enormous energy on the quantity of relationships rather than the quality. Moreover, despite most mental health professionals recommending people have 3 to 5 close friends, the New York Post on February 18, 2020 explains that when asked, people feel they should have far more than that. Second, technology lowers our tolerance for solitude. The ubiquity of digital connection makes any feeling of being alone seem abnormal. Technology has made it so that we never have to be alone. So during the rare occasions that we are, the emotion feels wrong, unhealthy, something that needs to be cured. Loneliness stretches far, even into our pocketbooks. So haunting is the specter of the emotion in Japan, the citizens have taken to renting friends to play with, talk with, or even just share a meal. The underlying desperation hints at two implications: medicalization and the secular value of church. First, the limits of medicalizing loneliness. The previously cited MIT Tech Review focuses on what specific neurons and hormones are stimulated by loneliness. And scientists have even gone so far as to create a pill to cure it. The U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration claims on their website that loneliness is as unhealthy as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. However, as Quartz on November 25, 2019 argues, medicalizing loneliness fails to acknowledge the cultural roots of the emotion. We now know that more people are lonelier than ever, but we still need to answer one lingering question. What do we do about it? Our detailed study of loneliness suggests it is more than a biological phenomenon. If that is true, then the so-called loneliness epidemic is more than a medical illness. It's a cultural failing. Finally, the secular value of church. It's no secret Americans are increasingly pivoting away from the church, in part catalyzing a rise in loneliness. But we may have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Let's look at an example. In her 2020 article from the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, LaTonya Trotter observed a community of residents in a nursing home, a population which reports the highest levels of loneliness in the country. According to the residents, church, not recreational or professional activities, was the greatest community building institution provided to them. And here's the kicker. Non-religious residents reported the exact same conclusion. In so many ways, we've replaced the insights of religion, and yet we find ourselves here, still drawn to the church, maybe not for God, but for each other. Today, we defined what loneliness is, found out how we got here, and explored implications of the loneliness epidemic. Because while the pandemic will end, our loneliness may not.